Welcome to the OneLife podcast, where we have rare but vital conversations about Jesus. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the OneLife podcast. OneLife is a startup church here in Nashville, Tennessee. Our mission is to build extended families of disciples that live on mission together. I am Tiffany Ketchum, and here with me is my husband and co-host, Tim Ketchum. What? Oh, scissors. What's that about?
We're about to find out.
I was wondering why you wanted the scissors. Thank you for tuning in to episode number 41. So we are right in the middle of trekking with Abraham and his journey. Is there anything we need to talk about or to remind the listeners of before we jump into this podcast today?
Yeah, I think the reason why we're spending so much time on Abraham is he's kind of like a model or a prototype, if you will, of faith, and that gets revisited in the New Testament, especially when talking about Jesus. And so we're trying to connect the tissues here between Old Testament story, New Testament story, and to kind of draw out some principles about what is it that Jesus is actually doing for us, and this is kind of prefigured in what God does with Abraham.
Yeah, Abraham's story does take up a lot of territory in Genesis,
No
but
pun
then
intended.
it's also in the New Testament as well a lot. So where are we going today?
So we're going to start off with Genesis 17, and this is where circumcision gets introduced into the story of Abraham, and we're going to kind of camp out on that for a little bit and probably do a couple episodes on it because it's a recurring theme throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament. It gets kind of worked out pretty regularly.
One of those strange but recurring themes.
Right, yeah.
What does this mean?
What does this mean?
Okay, well, let's get into it. And Genesis 17, starting in verse 1.
Yep. It says, when Abraham was 99 years old, and this is basically 13 years after the episode with Hagar and Ismael. So Ishmael's about 13 years old now.
Do you know off the top of your head how long it's been since God actually spoke to Abram?
You know, that's a good question. He's 99 right now, and I want to say it's been close to 24 years, maybe 25, depending on how you count your years.
So he's been waiting a lot of years
Long time.
for this promise that God made long
right.
ago to come about.
Yeah, he's still childless, and as we'll see later on in the text, he's still being called Father. Like that's actually his birth name. He's called an exalted or elevated father, and the irony just couldn't be any thicker. You know, you're 100 years old, you're called a father, and you don't have any kids, except for Ishmael. But that one is,
right,
you know, illegitimate from the standpoint of the promise.
Promise, sure.
All right, so the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am Almighty God. Walk before me and be blameless. Now, this phrase right here is kind of important because walk before me, that term there is my face. And so God is using highly relational language here. So the other person in the book of Genesis that walked with God would be Enoch and Noah. And basically, God is wanting Abraham to continue that intimate relationship of seeking his face. And then he tells him to be blameless. And this is kind of a bad translation. It basically means to be complete or whole. And it's one of the terms used to describe sacrificial offerings in the sacrificial system, that you had to bring an animal without any blemishes. It couldn't have a bum leg or a scar. And so God is basically not just saying, hey, be sinless. He's saying, I'm looking for holistic development here. I want every part of you to be developed and whole, and that's going to happen as you walk in intimate relationship with me. All right, moving on. Sorry, got bogged down there. Verse 2, and I will make, or I will give my covenant between me and you, and I will multiply you exceedingly. Okay, now there's nothing new here. Okay, like God has made this promise 25 years ago, and he's basically showing up again and reiterating the promise. So when God appears to Abraham, verse 3, it says, "Then Abraham fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying," verse 4, "As for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be a father of many nations," plural. Okay, this is the new part. This is something that God is introducing that he has not talked about yet. So far, God has only talked about Abraham becoming a great nation, that his descendants would become a great nation. But here, God introduces this idea that you're going to be a father of many nations. In other words, nations that are not necessarily just the nation that comes out of your own physical lineage. And so Paul is going to jump off from this verse in Romans 4 and is going to say this is an allusion to the Gentiles, that Abraham is not just the father of Israel, he's also the father of all the many nations of the Gentiles through faith. So this is kind of a new element that God is bringing into the picture here. And then he does something else that's new. Verse 5 says, "No longer shall your name be called Abram," which means elevated or exalted father, "but your name shall be called Abraham." This is where the letter H gets inserted into his name. "For I have made you a father of many nations." Okay, the word Abraham means a father of many, or a father of plenty. And so God is shifting his name because the scope of his fatherhood is being expanded here. So there's a widening of the scope in which Abraham is going to be a father. Verse 6, he says, "I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations," plural, "of you, and kings shall come from you." Verse 7, "And I will establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants after you in their generations, for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and your descendants after you. Also, I will give to you and your descendants after you the land in which you are a stranger." So this is the land of Canaan at the time. Abraham is wandering around, and he is in the land, but he doesn't actually, quote unquote, possess the land. And God is saying, this is going to be your land and your descendants' land, and I'm giving it to you as an everlasting possession. Verse 9, "And God said to Abraham, as for you, you shall keep my covenant." Okay, now this is the first time that there's some kind of sort of obligation that God is bringing into the picture for Abraham to do in regard to the covenant. Okay, so this is kind of important. God has told Abraham to do certain things in the past, but it's never been tied to the covenant, like explicitly. So it's kind of like a condition that is being brought into the covenant. He says, "You shall keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you." So this is something that's supposed to happen with every generation. And verse 10, "This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your descendants after you." And here it is. "Every male child among you shall be circumcised, and you shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you." Now, let's just pause right here. If you're Abraham and you're expecting to have a kid through God's power and his promise, and he's like, "Hey, by the way, I'm going to insert this new thing into our covenant relationship, into our agreement, and here it is." And Abraham's thinking, "Okay, well, what's this going to be? What's this going to be?" And then God says, "You're going to have to take out a knife, and you either do it to yourself or most likely someone else does it to you. And we're going to cut off the foreskin of your reproductive organ. if you're Abraham, you're probably thinking, wait, what? Like, why? Like, what does this have to do with our covenant? And is, the thing that I'm thinking as I'm reading through this is there a connection here between God expanding the scope of his fatherhood, the nations, and now bringing up this idea of circumcision, of cutting something away from his reproductive organ, which will actually be instrumental in producing those nations. So I do think there's a correlation here, and I've got an illustration to help us understand this, but I'll bring it up in a minute here.
Okay.
But I just want to set that up, that there's a widening of his fatherhood, and then there's a cutting away, or a narrowing, if you will, of his reproductive organ. Where are we at? Verse 12. So it's like when are they supposed to be circumcised? Verse 12, he who is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised. Which, by the way, this is probably trial and error, but today we know the medical purpose of 8 days is that your vitamin K skyrockets in the baby's body, which helps with blood clotting. And so if you circumcise the baby on the 7th day or the 9th day, they'll bleed longer. But on the 8th day is the most ideal day to circumcise someone because their blood's going to clot quicker. So on the 8th day, every male child in your generations, he who is born in your house or brought with money or bought with money from any foreigner who is not your descendant. Now, this is important too, because we tend to think that Israel is only comprised of people that were physically born from his lineage. But God is creating space here for foreigners, or for people who are not from the family of Abraham, to become a part of the covenant community. And so, for example, if they were to buy someone to become a part of their household, then that person would have to be circumcised, no matter how old they are. And this is important. This will come up later it's already come up in Galatians and Romans. But he who is born in your house and he who is bought with your money must be circumcised. Here's the phrase that I kind of want us to hone in on. And my covenant shall be in your flesh. It shall be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant. And the uncircumcised male child who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, that person, that is the child, shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. I want to get back to this correlation between widening the scope of Abraham's fatherhood to include the nations and this narrowing of his reproductive organ. Because I think the best analogy I could come up with is like let's say you're writing a book, okay, and you kind of get done with the first draft, and let's say in a moment of excitement you're thinking, oh great, this is finished, let's send it to the printer. Okay, well, you don't want to start printing a rough draft, right? It's
from experience.
That's right. We've written some things and published them, and so
lots of reading over and over.
That's right. There's lots of spelling errors. There's grammar mistakes. There's things you want to take out. You need to shift paragraphs around. I mean, there's a whole lot of work to do. You don't want to go to market. You don't want to start, spreading your work until you've narrowed it down, until you've edited it. And I think that's the correlation here that God is bringing up, is that if I'm going to widen the scope of your fatherhood, if we're going to go to market with this, if we're not just going to keep this in-house, then we're going to have to do a rigorous editing process. In other words, there's going to be something that's going to be cut away from your human nature. Circumcision was actually practiced in other cultures. This is not something new to Abraham, but God attaches a specific meaning to this. And I want to say that there's something here not only about if you're going to be the greater influence you're going to have, the more cutting away there's going to be. Because God will not want to reproduce something that is flawed. He's not going to want to spread something out and go to market unless he goes through a rigorous editing process. And the cutting away of the foreskin was symbolic of cutting away of something in our human nature that needed to be cleansed or separated from us in order that we can fulfill our role in the covenant. So I think there's something there to kind of entertain. And you kind of see this, pattern in how God deals with people, is that he takes them through a purification process. He takes them through a cleansing process, but it's in preparation to broaden their influence. So there's a cutting away so that you can spread out. So I think that's an important principle to keep in mind when we're talking about circumcision, especially in the Abrahamic covenant.
Cutting away things and refining process is definitely a theme when it comes to being a leader or having influence, like you said, in the Bible, but also just now. It's definitely something that God continues to do. And, I was thinking about how Abraham had to really trust God to go through with this. And if you notice in this passage that this is like a conversation. They're going back and forth. And like you said in the beginning, he was walking before God faithfully, and he was face to face with him as a friend. And so I just want to bring that up because there was a relationship here. Like, you can't expect to trust God if you don't know him, and if you don't have that kind of relationship with him. You can't expect to trust him to cut on you, to cut
perform
things
surgery
out, to prune things, You can't expect to trust his way for you either. And so that's like the core of how Abraham was able to go through all those years waiting, and also just trusting God that he would still come through at 100 years old, that he would still be able to have a child, and this promise would come through, That's very important to notice in this, is their relationship. And that means for us even today, not only are we talking to God, but we're hearing him, and we can have conversations with God.
Yeah, I really like that you're bringing this up about the relationship, because what's kind of interesting is after chapter 17, you see a lot of conversation between God and Abraham. Like, you've got the thing between him and about the destiny of Sodom and Gomorrah. God shows up at his tent, and Sarah laughs in the tent, and there's a lot more interaction here between Abraham and God that's recorded. And so the relationship is actually moving forward. It's progressing, and there is more quote unquote face-to-face interaction. And so, if we were to tie this back to another theme in the book of Genesis, is that there is this theme of death and life. And, when they sinned in the garden, death came in the picture, and they were exiled from the tree of life and also the mountain in which God's divine counsel was. And the way God kept them out of the garden was he placed angels with flaming swords. And this kind of indicated that if you want to make your way back into the presence, to the source of life, you're going to have to pass through a knife, and you're going to have to pass through fire if you're going to make your way back in. And what we see here is that this sword, or this knife of cutting away something, is surfacing in this narrative. And now that he's passing under the knife, you start to see more relational interaction with the source of life. Abraham and Sarah are kind of like a new Adam and Eve, but sort of in a post-fallen world. And they are kind of making their way back towards the source of life. And the closer they get to that source of life, the more productive or the more life-giving they become. But it's not without a cost. Something has to be cut away. And so there's a deepening in relationship, and then there's a narrowing in their human nature. So there's one more thing I want to point out here that I just kind of find interesting about circumcision, and it's that he says that this is a sign between me and you. Okay, now, not to state the obvious here, but you can't tell someone's circumcised just by looking at them, right? Like if you're a guy, how often do you see your reproductive organ? Basically when you use the restroom. But basically every time you observe your own reproductive organ, you're going to be reminded of this covenant that you have with God. And this is a sign between you and God. It's not a sign between you and other people. It's a sign between you and God. And this kind of gets back to God saying to Abraham, I want you to be face to face with me. And the thing that is actually going to produce life in other people is directly tied to your relationship with me. The other thing that's kind of interesting about this is that a child who is not circumcised, it actually says that that child has broken the covenant and is not allowed to be a part of the covenant community. And that's really strange to me because I'm thinking, well, it's not the kid's fault, right? But I think this kind of brings out this family dynamic of what circumcision was supposed to cultivate in Israel, is that there's a direct responsibility between the child and the parent when it comes to living in covenant with God. And so he's kind of bridging this, in America, we're very individualized. We're very, you just do your thing, you be you. And yet he's creating this very strong link between the parent and the child and the covenant relationship. Now, eventually a child could discover that, oh, wow, I'm not circumcised, but everyone else is. And they could initiate the process and have one of the elders, in their community to circumcise them. But I think this family dynamic is important because it's supposed to go from generation to generation to generation. And there's a responsibility of the parents to induct their child into the covenant that God was laying out. So
That's a lot of good stuff. There's clearly a lot in here to think about. Let's bridge it over to the New Testament real quick before we close this episode out. Are we going to Romans again, or?
Yeah, we're going to go to Romans 4, verses 16 and 17, and just very briefly bring out a place where Paul quotes this passage from Genesis 17, quotes a passage from Genesis 17.
Okay, I'll read it. Therefore, the promise comes by faith, so that it may be by grace and may be guaranteed to all Abraham's offspring, not only to those who are of the law, but also to those who have faith, the faith of Abraham. He is the father of us all. As it is written, I have made you a father of many nations. He is our father in the sight of God, in whom he believed, the God who gives life to the dead and calls into being things that are not.
If you wanted to put like a bumper sticker on this chapter, and we're gonna dig deeper into this in future episodes, but Paul is basically saying, who's your daddy? And he's saying Abraham is all of our daddy. And if you were a Jew and you liked the law of Moses and you wanted to keep the law of Moses, then Abraham is still your father. But some of those Jews had issues with Gentiles claiming Abraham as their father and therefore becoming an heir of the blessing that was promised through Abraham. And what Paul does is he says, hey, everybody, do you remember that time when God showed up and called Abraham a father of many nations? In other words, he is not just the God of Israel, he is the God of the whole world. And if you have the faith of Abraham, who was considered righteous before he was circumcised, then Abraham can be your father too. And that's where this thing about God's blessing coming to the nations is brought out in Paul's argument here in Romans 4. And he quotes Genesis 17 there to prove his point. So this is very much a part of Paul's vision of God wanting to bless every people group, every nation, every tribe, every tongue, every language. And all of them are going to find their ancestry, not in their ethnicity, but in Father Abraham. And that ancestry is secured and made sure when they have the same kind of faith that Abraham had, which is that God can bring life out of dead things. And ultimately that points to Jesus, of God raising Jesus from the dead. And that's how Paul's connecting all of this together, is eventually he's going to say, having faith like Abraham means you believe God raised Jesus from the dead, which creates new life out of dead things.
That's really good. Let's wrap it up here because we're running over time.
No.
Thank you so much for listening today, and subscribe if you want to keep hearing the conversation. Appreciate it, and we will catch you next time.